Hey, what's going on, people? I am back. Yes, I am back. Sarfo-Mensah, your host for Identity Talk for Educators Live with another action-packed episode. And I have here my good friend, Mr. Desmond Williams, who is the founder of Nylinka Education Solutions, which is an organization that is focused on professional development for educators. And also, he has a Twitter chat called SOBTC, Sending Our Boys to College, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then we have here the cover of his upcoming book, The Burning House, which is coming out very soon. So we have a lot to talk about. I have so much to say about this brother. Just getting to know him over the past year and a half or so. I've gotten to learn a lot about the work he's done in the DMV area as a special education teacher, as a school administrator, and now he's going out to different schools, sharing his work and trying to uplift and empower educators to provide quality education, not just for our Black boys, but for all children in our country and beyond. So I want to take this time to welcome Mr. Desmond Williams to the show. What is going on, good brother?
Brother Kwame, thanks for having me, man. Thanks you for that warm introduction. It's humbling. But thank you for that introduction, and thank you for all the work that you do. Being Mr. International now, right? From the Philly to the continent. So we thank you for all the work that you do as well, trying to fill in the relevance gap, as we say. So thank you for that.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So let's get started. Now, before you became this big time educator, you know, you were a youngin' growing up in Detroit. But that's the extent of what I know. So I want you to go ahead and fill in the blanks for us. So early beginnings, you know, what got you to the field of education?
I'm originally from Detroit, born and raised. And speaking of my book, I talk about this to some degree, but I was an A student until I got to ninth grade. I had a traumatic experience with a teacher who essentially told me that the things that I was interested in were not important. And that was freshman English, ninth grade year. And again, trauma and how it affects people and how it impacts people is it wasn't something that we were talking about in the early 1990s. I ended up graduating from high school with a 2.1 GPA. So I ended up in junior college. I had the opportunity, you know, I'm dating myself here, but in 1995, I had the opportunity to come to Washington, D.C. for the Million Man March, and it changed my life. Wow. And when I say change, I mean, not even a 360, it was a 720.
Wow.
And I had already wanted to come to Howard University, hence the sweatshirt I'm wearing there. I had already wanted to come to Howard, but I convinced myself that I wasn't going to let anything stop me. So I came to Howard, didn't major in education, but knew I wanted to be a teacher. And once I graduated, that was it. I jumped into the field. Like a lot of Black men, we get elevated and escalated pretty quickly. So my third year in a classroom, I was already serving as a quasi-administrator in special education. Wow. From there, I went to work downtown. I ended up becoming a principal of a special needs school. I kind of came back to the non-alternative route, if you will, and went back to traditional education, and eventually ended up being principal of an all-boys school here in the District of Columbia called the Bishop Walker School for Boys. And that was another pivotal moment because that changed how I viewed education, but it changed how I viewed the education of Black children to the degree that everything I had learned was about controlling and manipulating Black children because of fear of who they were.
Yeah.
And that philosophy, that paradigm, was a Eurocentric philosophy rooted in Eurocentric psychology and rooted out of fear and racism and hate and ignorance and everything that goes with white supremacy. So
Yes.
I had to siphon that out and do a detox. And that's partially what the book is about. But ultimately, along the way, I became a better educator. But part of being a better educator, when you talk about shaping identity, was becoming more informed myself in terms of what teaching is. It's not teach kids how to balance equations. It's teaching kids how to solve problems in their community through balancing equations.
Yeah.
But that was never taught to me explicitly. It just kind of, I had to figure that out. And it took about 12 years, right, to kind of figure that out. So that's me in a nutshell in terms of kind of my identity and what shaped me as a teacher and what shaped me as an administrator.
All right, awesome. And I think as educators, when we first get into this field, we don't think about this idea of developing agency. You know, we don't think about that. We always think about, you know, how to teach them this lesson, you know, the technical aspects of teaching. All right, do the lesson plan, execute the lesson, give the kids a test after you've given them some practice problems, and they just keep it moving. We don't really spend a whole lot of time understanding how that knowledge can be used as a way to transform the outcomes in their communities and their own lives.
Yeah.
So, but now with all the research going on, you know, people are just throwing out, you know, this whole buzzword of culturally responsive teaching. And to the point now where it's become co-opted, you know, and don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm an advocate for it, but I feel like we've gotten to a point now where we need to redefine what that means, because so many people are claiming to be culturally responsive teaching specialists and experts, and they have not gone through the experiences that at least we as Black folks and even students of color, teachers of color have gone through.
Yeah, I remember, this was a long time ago. I'm going to probably say this was in the early 2000s when Pat Summerall and John Madden were still working together.
Oh, NFL,
as a broadcast team.
Yep.
And I can't remember the phrase that John Madden used, but Pat, he used a slang term. And Pat Summerall said, well, the term no longer belongs to the inner city because it's made it into the mouth and into the lexicon of John Madden. And that statement is so true. Once it gets taken from us and it becomes a buzzword in a Twitter sphere or in white liberal America, then we have to redefine the term. Because it has been, you use the term co-op, but it's been stolen. Yeah. It's been stolen, and its original intent and what Gloria Billings-Ladson and what those people were talking about, even David Bell, Faces at the Bottom of the World, you lose that. And one of the things that I kind of learned, or at least suspect, is one of the things that I argue is that a lot of the revolutionary voice that African people had in the 60s has been taken. It was just completely stripped. It was sterilized. It was inoculated, squelched, and completely taken away. And what we found is it kind of came out in urban communities in the form of rap music. And now we're taking that rap pedagogy and that same spirit and energy, and it's being infused into what we do in educational and to intellectual spaces as Africans, but it's not new. And we're consistently taking this information. We're consistently taking these terms and these philosophies and these ideologies, and we're trying to keep them so that we can use them for transformation, as you said, as opposed to a buzzword like grit and rigor and all of those things that make teachers fall asleep when you're trying to do PD. It's like, okay, today we're going to talk about rigor. You just fall asleep, right? That kind of a thing.
Right.
So yeah.
And this is something that I know I talked about with Dr. Sean Willie. So he's actually been a guest on this show. Okay. And we talk about this idea of our culture being appropriated by white America, but also how it's helped to transform, hip hop culture has helped to transform the educational platforms. When you look at, Hip Hop Ed with Dr. Chris Emden, when you look at things like vocabulary, which people now use. Now you see people rapping content to their classes. And but then there was a time when it was taboo.
Right.
I think about the trial, Congress getting that 2 Live Crew and Uncle Luke. I think about Ice-T. I think about all the things that happened in the late 80s, early 90s of hip hop, where there was so much controversy around the culture to the point where you had white America just saying, your kids shouldn't be listening to this music. The music causes all kinds of gang violence, and it's the root to all the issues that were happening in terms of violence. And then now you fast forward.
And it's interesting because it was on, and I don't want to move the conversation, so let me know if I'm taking us down a road you don't want to go. But it was both sides of what the music represented. It was the NWA and the 2 Live Crew and the Ice-T, but it was also the X-Clan and the KRS-One. Yes. And I remember saying, someone saying, KRS-One shouldn't be making records like, why is that? Because there's no factual evidence that the people in the Bible are Black. Well, what he's saying is a refutation of the idea that the people in the Bible are white. And obviously, people who depict Christianity, whether it be the 10 Commandments or pictures of Jesus that we see everywhere, obviously there's a belief somewhere that these people were white. So why can't he say that these people are of African descent, or at least are people of color? So we were getting it on both sides, and it was coming from parents, it was coming from schools, it was coming from the streets, it was coming from politicians like C. Dolores Tucker, God bless her and rest her soul. But we were getting it on all sides. So it wasn't just scantily clad women in a Luther Campbell show, or Ice-T on the Oprah Winfrey show, saying all of these negative things about Juan Williams and his wife. If you haven't seen that, Kwame, you have to go back. I'm sure it's on YouTube.
I'm sure it should be on YouTube at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, Juan Williams is still a reporter. I think he's with the Washington Times, but he's on national news as a political pundit.
He was on Fox though for a minute. Juan Williams.
He was on Fox for a very long time. He was on Fox for a very long time. But him and Ice-T are on an Oprah Winfrey show, and this is probably before New Jack City. But probably around 1990, 1991-ish, I'm guessing. But they are going at it intellectually. And Ice Cube is defending the music, and in a certain way, Juan Williams is too. But what Juan Williams is saying is, you all can be more selective in how you censor your content, knowing that some of our kids who listen to this music are not being monitored. And Ice-T was saying, why don't you deal with the violence and the racism and the sexism that we see in our communities? And then we can change what we're reflecting. It was a very, again, I didn't want to take us down that road, but and that's probably 30 years ago now. That was 1990-ish. So, yeah. And now they just take. Go back to you and Dr. Sean's point. Just take, and recreate for their own financial gain. So nothing's new.
Yeah,
nothing's new.
Yes, but just to, cap that point, I just brought up to say that it's amazing how the culture gets appropriated, but yet when it comes to retaining Black teachers, when it comes to doing things pedagogically that will have a positive impact on educational lives of Black children, we kind of turned a blind eye to that. It's like controversial, but yet there are certain parts that they do take. So it's almost like selective. Like, you know what? We're going to take these parts of the culture, but guess what? We don't want y'all in these classrooms. They say that they want us in there, but how come we're not getting retained at higher rates? Why is there so much attrition when it comes to us, in the field? But that's something that we can definitely talk about more later on. But let's keep this thing moving. So, we have here Nylinka School Solutions, which you founded. Can you just share with us what inspired you to start Nylinka? How do you come up with the name first off? And then you can go into the mission of what you're doing with Nylinka.
Yeah, so Nylinka is a term that was given to me by a young boy in my neighborhood. He lived across the street from me, and I was going to hang out one day. I was 16-ish. He was probably about 9. And, I would see him every now and then. But he was hanging out playing with his Matchbox cars, and I was waiting on some friends to come and pick me up. And, ultimately he ended up showing me some drawings of these cars that he had made. And I was like, yo, these are dope. And he was like, yeah, one day I'm going to own my own car company, and it's going to be called Nylinka.
What?
And I was like, yo, that is dope. And he was 9 or 10 years old. Kwame, I saw him one more time after that. And I don't know what happened to him. And, needless to say, there is no Nylinka Motor Company. There's no Nylinka anything. So I literally took the name to represent the dreams and the aspirations of children across the world. And founded my company on the principle that we can help children meet their dreams, solving one school-based problem at a time. Wow. So that's the story behind the name. You can't live your dream, then maybe I can help other people live their dreams through your legacy and your vision.
Wow. Yeah. I never knew that story. That's dope, man. That's dope.
Yeah.
As far as the mission of Nylinka, what are you setting out to accomplish with it?
Ultimately, it's two-pronged. What I found is we as educators and schools enter discussions are at different points in their development in terms of meeting the needs of students, particularly boys of color, and things that I find very mundane and basic. A lot of schools have trouble implementing and doing or even knowing. So, part of my reason in starting the company was to kind of share my wealth, share my knowledge with a broader audience. And to be completely honest, another part of it was time freedom. When I started the company, my wife and I had just had our second child, and I had been a principal, and I was looking for some respite and more time freedom to spend with my children. So the opportunity to set my own schedule, to be more involved in the life of my own daughter was really important to me. And, there were just times when, my daughter is 4, but I didn't know her teacher last year, because I was so wrapped up in what was happening in the schools I was running. So trying to create more of a life balance, but also trying to take the wealth out of the place where I had been principal at and where I had been teaching at, and sharing it to a broader audience. So, yeah.
That's what's up. And then through Nylinka, you have an offspring of initiatives that you've created in the process. So I know on Twitter, you have the Send Our Boys to College Twitter chat that happens periodically. And I mean, college access is a huge topic, especially when it comes to our people.
But it didn't really feel like it. Okay. We didn't do things that had cultural markers. There was no ethnic or cultural representation of our students. My principal and I, truth be told, we did not get along. We didn't see eye to eye on things. And I was pretty vocal about her blind spots. And she was pretty vocal about, well, she was pretty passive about not letting me fill certain leadership positions and not letting me have a voice in other leadership positions. So, you know, I had joined Twitter and I was participating in chats. And one of the things that I noticed is that it was a great place to pick up information, but it was also, these spaces were really great places with flat playing fields where principals were learning from teachers and principals were learning from administrative aides. And it was just a flat surface where all of this information sharing and all of this archiving of information, but there was nothing around Black boys. And at that time, hip hop ed was happening, and the educolor chats were happening, but there was nothing that was talking about pedagogy around Black children, and there certainly wasn't anything around Black boys. So I was just trying to fill a space, but I was also trying to fill a void in what I thought was me being silenced in a place that I was giving a lot to. So as I was learning, I wanted to bring voices together, because I needed to know more. But again, people were entering these conversations at various points. And we just started information sharing. And it's been a wonderful experience. I had a sister who's in Michigan who's trying to start her own school. There's a lady in Texas who's participated in a chat who pulled her children out of Dallas public schools and now has started a homeschool co-op. And I actually hired a teacher who had been a participant on the chat. I hired him. He moved from Detroit, Michigan, came to Washington, D.C.
Little biased, don't you think, no, sir?
You know what? It in that sense, no, because when you came in the building, you hit it out the park.
Sure.
Yeah, and then I ended up hiring another brother who is actually at an uncommon school in Brooklyn. So, there are other relationships that I've been told about that have happened organically from people just coming together and sharing information. And, social media can be a great thing. So that was the onus for starting the chat. When you talk about college access, the SOBTC, the college part is really just a metaphor for helping Black males reach their preferred futures. I don't necessarily believe that all African Americans and all African American males should attend college, but I do believe that everybody deserves the opportunity to do what they want to do without the obstacles and hurdles of racism and systemic oppression. So the college part is a metaphor, and we talk about many things, but I try to center the conversation around pedagogy, around management, and around helping teachers take little nuggets that they can take into their classroom the next day. The chat is every second and fourth Sunday. We're going to change that probably come this March, and it's going to be once a month. We're still kind of working that out, but schedules are everywhere. So we'll probably move once a month, but it'll be either the second or the fourth Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Second or fourth, not Thursday, second or fourth Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Yeah.
So you mentioned that sending our boys to college is a metaphor. And it's really more about providing our boys with opportunities, post-secondary school opportunities. If it's not college, maybe it's getting into a career, going into the workforce, or another alternative path. Now, my question is, do you feel like our school system, and I've talked about this with other people and had my views about it, but I just want to hear from you. Do you believe that our school system, as it's currently constructed, needs to be totally revamped in a way such that we provide our students with opportunities early on so they can know what path to take post-secondary, whether it's going into a work apprenticeship, whether it's going to community college, whether it's going to college, whatever the case may be, because you have magnet schools, you have vocational schools. You know, the Perkins Act has been in effect for years. But what's happened is with the Perkins Act, it's become this thing where, okay, we're going to focus on trying to bridge a gap between post-secondary schools and secondary schools by providing elective courses in high school where, okay, you have the option of taking maybe a couple of classes here and there, but it's not mandatory.
Right.
So should there be more of an intentional effort given the advances we've had, you know, in our world and the changes that have taken place?
So you used the term revamp, and I just don't believe the Honorable Elijah Muhammad told Malcolm X, he said that history is best qualified to reward our research. Meaning, if you want to know how to solve a problem, maybe you should look at a group or an individual in the past who has had your problem and look at what they did to solve that problem.
Right.
And, you know, as painful as it is, and it's probably one of the reasons why kids hate history and why you can't find good history teachers, is because it is truth, and the truth will ultimately set you free. But we have been down this road before, and I don't think we can fix and revitalize and revamp schools as we see them now. And the reason why I say that is there's plenty. We would, I mean, this would be a 12-part chat to go through all of those.
Yeah.
But it boils down to racism. And essentially, African children or children of African descent in this country were never given an education that was designed to level the playing field for them. And even if you look after Brown versus Board of Education, which really is not a seminal act, but we can start there from an intellectual perspective.
Sure.
You don't have, you have a series of laws that were passed at the state level and even at the federal level that undermined this notion of integration, right? And even with integration, the only reason why many people of African descent were interested in integration is because they knew that racism was so strong that white people were not going to allow their children to languish in school. So we as Black people, we are going to send our children to school with other white children, not because they are white, but because they are not going to let their children fail. So the notion of integration has failed us. Separation, segregation has failed us, right? Because of racist policies and discrimination and the way we fund schools and things like that. I think the option that African people in this country have explored, it has been thwarted and needs to be re-explored and re-explored, is opening and running and controlling our own schools. And there is a book out, and you know this as an author, but have you ever written something or like been rereading your book and you say, man, I wish I had said that.
Oh yeah.
Like literally
Of course.
Exactly. So on the heels of finishing my book, the last chapter talks about kind of where do we go from here? Like what needs to happen next? And literally I ran into a book by an old colleague / friend of mine / fraternity brother. His name is Russell Rickford.
Okay.
And Russell is a professor at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. He's an associate professor in the School of Education, and he wrote a book called We Are African People. And the book details what African people in America were doing in the 1960s, starting their own schools. And he outlines what happened to thwart and undermine those efforts. Okay, it's an amazing book. It's an amazing read. And it's literally what I would say, it was the book that I wanted to write next. Like, this is the blueprint for starting our own schools. When we talk about 2% or whatever the number of African-American male teachers is in the school system, that's a problem, but it's not a big a problem as you don't have schools to educate your own children. Because if you did, you could hire African-American males and you could recruit African-American males and you could retain African-American males. You could start schools that would educate African-American males. So that's actually the bigger issue, control and ownership. So do I believe that schools as they currently exist are going to serve our people? There's no real indication that they have done so at this point. And my degrees and your degrees are not evidence to the contrary of that.
No.
Neither are the degrees of any person who considers himself to be African American. We are statistical anomalies, and that's just actual fact, as my mentor would say.
Oh, we're still anomalies to this day. I mean, when we come into these schools, they look at us like we're aliens. Like, oh wow, we're a phenomenon. And I mean, I guess that's part of the reason why we're able to get certain jobs. It's almost like affirmative action in a sense, you know, like, we got to fill up this quota. We got this, black guy right here. Let's get him into the school just to say that we're being diverse.
It's the lowest form of tokenism in affirmative action.
Yeah.
It's the lowest form of tokenism.
Yeah.
And I use the term, I was on another podcast. This is a book I should write, but I actually use the term field goal kickers.
Oh.
And if you think about field goal kickers, right? And for any of your listeners who are not sports fans, I'm sure they will be able to follow this analogy. But if you watch any football, pro or college, the field goal kicker is off on his own.
Yeah.
He's an anomaly. He is not part of the team. They gave him a jersey with a number on it because they couldn't give him a square root. He's a weirdo. He doesn't have a shoe on. He is a token. And he gets called upon when the team is unable to do their job.
Wow.
I.e., we can't control these black boys over here, right? Or there's a fight in the cafeteria. Wow. Or such and such is going to a conference. Can you cover her class? When they get in trouble, send out the field goal kicker, i.e. the black man, and let him kick a 60-yard field goal to save the day. And they'll pat him on the back. They'll lift him over their shoulders. But when they go into the locker room, there ain't nobody talking to him.
Wow.
That's black men in education. You are a field goal kicker. And you go from this team to this team to this team to this team. And your identity on that team, on all of those teams, is very much the same. And if you are a field goal kicker who can return kicks and who can tackle and block, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. Like, why are you playing football? You could have played basketball. Like, it's like the weirdest thing ever, man. So that's us in the field of education, in my in my opinion. That's us.
I've never heard that analogy before ever in my life, but that's like the perfect analogy. The perfect analogy. Because I know that's how you felt and still feel. And I echo those same feelings about my place in this education space. Even as we're doing all this work, there's still a part of us, you know, that feels like not like we have something to prove, but we have to like justify who we are and legitimize our credentials and legitimize our standing within this space.
And you know, I didn't feel that way at the start of my career. When I began teaching, I was in a pretty big elementary school. It was a K through 5. We had about 65 staff members. I was the only young Black male. My principal was the Black male. Our business manager was a Black male. And our PE and computer teachers were Black male. So I had support. I was the only young Black male, but I had a lot of teachers, mostly Black women, taking me under their wing. And the one thing my principal said to me, his name was Desmond Williams, he said, you have to become a master of pedagogy. He said, when I come into your room, your kids are quiet, you have good relationships with your children, but you don't know how to teach. You have to become a master of pedagogy. So I didn't feel isolated. I didn't feel attacked. It really wasn't until I became a principal that when I started really spreading my wings and having opinions on what should happen, that other principals and my boss and my boss's boss started saying, you think you know too much. That's when the tension of being intelligent and being voiced and having strong opinions as a Black male was actually contrary to the alternative identities that people were trying to place on me, if you will.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Man, but we've talked about a lot of different things, and I know this year is going to be big for you in terms of Nylinka, in terms of just the new book coming out, The Burning House. Y'all gotta go get that book. I know I'm going to get a copy.
I got your address.
Hopefully be autographed.
Yes, sir. February 14th, 2020. It's I promise it's coming. Like before we came on, I was talking about making an analogy between some rap albums that just took forever and ever and ever and ever to come. But it's, you know, it's here. And
there you go.
I think it's going to be part of the narrative that'll push dialogue about what we should be doing differently in these spaces for our children. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And there's so much great work happening around this issue. So many great books, great content. You can even go on Twitter. You see people talk about some of these issues that you bring about in this book, such as Eurocentric curriculum. And I even talked about it a little bit in my latest article on cultural indoctrination. Because there was a guy who challenged my Edutopia article, which I released on how to make your math classrooms more culturally responsive through pedagogy. And then there was a guy who was saying that I was providing my students with indoctrinated beliefs about police brutality, because that was the focus of the project that I talk about in the article. And so my stance was like, well, this is the live experience of so many of my students. I don't have to impose my views on this issue when so many of my students live it every single day and have had family members die as a result of it. I don't need to, pigeonhole them into this thought process. This is how they felt even entering, the project. But it's amazing how some people, they look at you trying to help your students develop agency, and then they try to make it seem like you're putting these liberal ideas into to keep these kids' heads. And it's like, no, that's not what
The irony of his or her rebuttal would be, that is what education looks like in 99% of the spaces in this world. We are indoctrinating. But the indoctrination doesn't work if it's contrary to my political or my socio-political beliefs.
Sure.
But really, that's the issue. It's not what you're teaching kids. You're teaching kids something contrary to what I believe to be the true narrative, right?
Yeah.
So, and we should be able to sit down and say, right, we should be able to have a dialogue and say, I disagree with that.
Right.
Because of this. You shouldn't do that because of this. Like that really needs to be the conversation. And those are the conversations we need to be able to have in our schools, right? Like we don't want to create an echo chamber where children believe the same things, but because we're segregated, our realities are pretty much the same. So we do in our schools kind of live in these echo chambers, but so did he, right? So, how do we create spaces where people can have open and active dialogue without hurting feelings and come away feeling as though I can learn something from this person, I can listen to this person without the vitriol of hate and anger and frustration and a lack of empathy and all of those other things. But, sometimes you just have to let people believe what they believe.
Yeah. And that's the sad part, because that was an opportunity to have that dialogue, a good opportunity for us to have some intellectual discourse around this issue. But some people don't want to engage in that because a part of them believes that, you know what, I don't care what you say, I'm going to still believe what I believe in, like you said, and there's really no way to address that. But like I said, we have so many great things going on, this year. So much great content. I'm about to add this book to my list of books that I need to read. It's growing every day.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely gonna find the time to read them. But before we sign off, could you just share with people your information via social media, as well as a website for Nylinka, so that they can connect with your work and support you in your mission?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn at Desmond Williams, but on social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, that's at Nylinka. My website is www.nylinka.org. That's N-Y, N as in Nancy, Y as in you, right? Link, LINKA.org. The book you'll be able to purchase on February the 14th, 2020 on Amazon. You'll also be able to purchase it on my website. The book is called A Burning House, Educating Black Boys in Modern America. And essentially, I wrote the book to highlight my miseducation as a teacher. And I wanted to give other educators the opportunity to sidestep a lot of the problems that I fell into as an educator. But I also wanted to give a different lens of what we're looking at, like what's happening with Black boys. And the word that comes up a lot is disenfranchisement, and disenfranchisement. And that is the name of the game for white supremacy as it relates to Black boys in school. Disenfranchised. And if I can disenfranchise you, it is easier to dehumanize you, and it is easier to make you a statistic, be a special education, be a dropout, or be a school to prison pipeline. Like that is it. So I don't spend a lot of time talking about culturally relevant content or even the school to prison pipeline, because again, those are real issues. But I think in a lot of ways they were kind of turned off to them because of social media and because of people's access to information.
Mm-hmm.
I try to reach my readers through some experiences that I had that I know that they are seeing through a different lens, and I color them in such a way as to make the reader think, why is it that I had not thought of this before, and what am I going to do differently? Because educating our children is not about do nows and exit tickets and hooked on phonics versus shared reading versus sitting your children in rows versus cooperative grouping. That's if that's what you're thinking, you missed the boat.
Just one last quote, because the burning house, people don't realize this actually comes from a Martin Luther King quote. And I figured because his birthday is coming up, I feel it'd be appropriate to just read the quote so that people can get the context of that title. So the quote states, "I feel like we have integrated into a burning house." And this is from the great, the late Dr. Martin Luther King. And I mean, to this day, we have a lot of our young people, young Black people, going into burning houses. And we find ourselves trying to rescue them from those so they don't, fall captive to that. But go ahead, sir.
And again, it makes no sense to try to rescue someone from a situation that you willfully place them in.
True.
So again, we as adults, we have some work to do, right?
Yeah.
As my mentor said, if you're going to give your children to a system that has been hostile to them, then you deserve what you get. You deserve what you get. So, I think, that quote was said to Harry Belafonte in a private conversation between the two of them. But for your listeners, Dr. King also says it in a May 8th, 1967 interview with NBC News. And that interview is about 24 minutes. And he says it, and then he reiterates it. And he talks about that notion of integrating in a burning house in terms of the civil rights movement not giving African people everything that they wanted from the civil rights movement. So he's in a very reflective and contemplative space. And that's kind of the inspiration for the book and inspiration for me reflecting on what I thought was going really well that actually wasn't. So thank you again, sir.
Thank you. And on that note, we're going to sign off. And if you want to see more episodes of Identity Talk for Educators Live, more content, please subscribe to the YouTube page. And yes, you can get a copy of my book, Shape Teacher Identity, from my website, www.identitytalk4educators.com. You could also get more episodes of Identity Talk for Educators Live on YouTube by subscribing under my name, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And you can see me on all social media platforms. But once again, we're going to sign off. This is Kwame Sarfo-Mensah on behalf of the homie Desmond Williams. We're going to see you another time. Peace.
Peace. Stay loved.